you to DePaul tonight. Thank you for coming. My name is Sally Julian, and I'm the Associate Dean in the College of Education, and I just wanted to give you a little information about the format. So Jonathan Kozol will be coming out and speaking, and he will speak for approximately an hour, and then there'll be a question and answer session after. So for those of you who may be here with the class and have to leave, we want you to know that for those of you who would like to stay for the question and answer session, it will be in depth. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dean Dr. Paul Zients of the College of Education.
Good evening, and welcome to DePaul. One of the things that Sally forgot to mention was that the questions and answers will be on cards, so you'll have to point to somebody, and they'll have a card, they'll give it to you, you can write the cards on the cards. I want to thank you for joining us this evening, and before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to thank Jeanette Srivastava, who really put all of this together through her generosity and her vision. It's an honor to introduce to you the nation's most widely read and highly honored education and activist, Jonathan Kozol. We were talking about Mr. Kozol in our office, and I'm a bit old, and many of the people in my office are a bit young, and it occurred to us that almost all of us read Jonathan Kozol as one of the first books that we read in education, and the impact that he has had on our profession is remarkable. 50 years ago, rising to the occasion that was the civil rights movement, Kozol gave the prospect of a promising career in the academic world and became a fourth-grade teacher to devote his life to the challenge of providing equal opportunities to every child in our public schools. He's the founder of the Cambridge Institute for Public Education, a nonprofit that aims to prevent the drain of qualified teachers from public schools, and Education Action, a nonprofit that serves as a resource for education activists looking to connect with like-minded individuals and organizations pursuing various education reform movements. Mr. Kozol is the recipient of the 1968 National Book Award in Science, Philosophy, and Religion for Death at an Early Age, a description of his first year as a teacher. Among his other major works are Rachel and Her Children, which received the John F. Kennedy Book Award, and Savage Inequalities, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Award Circle in 1992. In his 1995 bestseller, Amazing Grace, The Lives of Children and Conscience of a Nation, received the Ansfield Wolf Book Award in '96, an honor previously granted to the works of Langston Hughes and Dr. Martin Luther King. The Shame of the Nation appeared on the New York Times bestseller list the week that it was published. In an era of persistent inequality and obsessive testing, Jonathan continues to visit children in their classrooms and encourage principals and teachers in their endeavors. As an advocate for children from low-income communities and for racial diversity in our schools and universities, Jonathan has been speaking to overflow crowds of educators and community stakeholders invested in the cause of education, and tonight is no exception. We are indeed fortunate to be in this room with him today. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Kozol.
Thanks so much, Paul, and special thanks to Sally Julian, who did so much work to make this evening possible. I'm really grateful to you, Sally. Thanks so much. Now, I asked Sally for a little updated information on the Chicago schools, and she sent me about 400 pages. Thank you for re-educating me. Thanks to Sonia Soltero and all the other members of the faculty here in the School of Education at this wonderful Vincentian University. I also want to give special thanks to, and it's so hard to pronounce her name, but I'm going to try, Jeanette Srivastava. I think I got one syllable right there. Jeanette wrote to me last April and asked if I would come here to DePaul to speak in celebration, that I'm quoting her exactly, of her 40 years on this earth. It was her birthday yesterday, and I couldn't turn down that kind of invitation. So thank you so much, Jeanette. And very briefly, I have an awful lot of wonderful friends here in this room tonight, and I'm not going to name them all, but I have to give a good big shout out to one of my oldest, most beloved friends, Bill Ayers. And also to two of my other old friends and allies, Mike and Susan Klonsky, who are here with us tonight. I was going to say two of my favorite people in Chicago, but really two of my favorite people anywhere. And wherever I go, they seem to pop up. And they always take good care of me. So thank you so much, Mike and Susan. And finally, thanks to each and every student from the university who are with us here tonight. Some of you look so young to me. It renews my spirit just to be with you. How many real live teachers from the public schools are with us here tonight? Oh, I'm so glad. I always feel safer when I'm in a room with teachers. Teachers don't receive the honor they deserve. They never did, but even less today. But I say this everywhere I go. Teachers in our public schools have always been my heroes. I think it's just one of the most beautiful ways to spend your life. Especially, I hope you won't be mad at me for saying this, especially the teachers who work in the elementary grades with little pint-sized people. Those are the grades I used to teach. So thank you all for being here. Well, as some of you know, I've spent almost my entire life working among the poorest of poor children. I started out in 1964 as a fourth grade teacher in one of the deeply segregated public schools of Boston. I had never intended to become a teacher. I'd gone to Harvard, forgive me for that, and I'd majored in English literature and spent 4 years studying Elizabethan poetry. And wrote my senior honors thesis on Shakespeare and John Donne. And then by some mistake, I won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford. I say it was a mistake because Rhodes Scholars are supposed to be, you're not just supposed to be a good student, you're also supposed to be an athlete and very sociable, and graceful. And I was no athlete. I never even passed the swimming test at Harvard. And I was very awkward. When I went for my interview, it was like a cocktail party. And I remember they were watching me to see if I knew how to behave. And I knew this would happen. I was terrified. They handed me a glass of wine in a thin stem glass, filled to the top. And I spilled it all over my host. But I won and I ended up at Oxford. I didn't like Oxford. I found it boring, actually. It was also since I'd already been there because everybody at Harvard spoke in a phony British accent. So I moved to Paris and I spent a couple of years trying to learn how to write. And I was very fortunate that some of the great American writers were living in Paris at the time. My first night in Paris, I physically bumped into probably the best-known African-American novelist of that time, Richard Wright. I stepped on his toe, actually. I'm sorry about that. Maybe I spent my whole life repenting. James Baldwin was there at the time. Also, I came back to the United States finally, and I was going to go back to graduate school and become an English professor. And to be honest with you, I would have loved to have spent my life that way. It would have been great to spend my life, in some wonderful college where I could have a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, And I would have done that if it weren't for extraordinary events that happened early that summer in 1964, when thousands of young people, black and white, and well, all races, were pouring down into Mississippi in order to try to break the back of apartheid in that state. And this was the sort of the crescendo of the civil rights movement of that era. And 3 of these young people went ahead of the others in order to locate churches and other places where they could register poor folks to vote, where they could teach them to read well enough because of literacy restrictions so that they could vote. And one night in June, they disappeared. Now, black activists had disappeared forever in the South, and the nation never paid too much attention. But this time it happened, it was a mixed group, black and white together. And 2 of them were New Yorkers. And this time the nation did pay attention, and a wave of alarm swept across the country. Alarm which proved to be justified a couple weeks later when their bodies were found buried beneath the mud in a farm outside of a small town of Philadelphia, Mississippi, murdered, as it turned out, by local police and by the Ku Klux Klan. That event changed my life forever. One day, I was back in Cambridge, near Harvard University, about to enroll in grad school. And one day, I simply got in my little car. This was the 60s, so it was a very little car. It was a VW Bug with faces on it, painted on the side. I drove over into the black community. I had grown up in the suburbs of Boston. I'd never been in the black community before. It shows how divided we were and still are today. And I simply went to a black minister, an Episcopal priest, who was Dr. Martin Luther King's representative in New England. And I just went to him, I said, "May I be of use?" And he said, "Yes, young man, you can be of use." He said, you had a privileged education. I'd like to see you share it with our children. Become a teacher. So, I just walked into the Boston School Department the next day and said, "I'm going to be a teacher." I'd never heard of certification. And they said, "Where'd you go to college?" And I said, "Harvard." And they said, "Well, then you can't be a teacher because you couldn't learn anything useful at Harvard." So I said, there must be some way I could do it. And then I learned sort of the dirty little secret of inner city schools. They said, "Well, sure, you can be a sub." I said, "Why not?" So I remember my father was worried about me by that age because he thought I was just drifting in life, and he thought, I was 26 by then, he thought by that age a Rhodes Scholar should be doing something important in the world. at very least be the governor of an insignificant state. So I took him to lunch and I said, "Dad, I've got a job. What are you doing?" "I'm a sub." I said, that was the hardest thing I ever did in my life. The first time I ever taught, they sent me into kindergarten. I had no idea what you do with people that size. To me, they were like gerbils. They'd crawl over me. But I survived somehow, so they promoted me to 4th grade. And the school in which they sent me to teach was just a nightmare. I described it in my first book, Death in Early Age. Among other things, I mean, we had huge classes, just as you do in Chicago public schools today. And the kids in my class had a run of subs before me, so they didn't really trust me, am I going to abandon them also? And the these little kids were getting desperate, and one little boy started mumbling to himself, and they'd take him down the basement where the assistant principal was a tall, white, mean guy, would whip him with a bamboo whip. The first thing they told me when I got to the school was that I should go out to the school supply store and buy my whip. And I did. I went out there to see where they really sold whips. I mean, this is Boston, It's supposedly a liberal city. And there were the whips next to the blackboard pointers. I didn't buy one, but anyway, that's what the school was like. And the kids in my class really didn't trust me, as I say, because so many white teachers had come and gone, and some black teachers too, but mostly white. And so I was sort of desperate to find some way to win them over. It took me until the spring, and suddenly occurred to me, I mean, all of you know this already, but there was no field of like multicultural studies in those days. It suddenly occurred to me that there was nothing relevant to their lives in the books that we had in school. They were either all white books, or else every 7 pages one child would be painted slightly tan. And they were boring little stories, not so different from today, aligned with exams. And so one day I just went to a bookstore in Cambridge. I just walked in and bought a brand new book, a book of poetry by Langston Hughes. And I brought it into school the next day. And before I even opened the book, there was a sudden silence in the room because there was a picture of the poet on the front cover. And a little girl in the front row whispered to a girl next to her. She said, "Look it, that man's colored." And you could see something had happened in the room. I opened the book, and I read one poem. Well, I read a couple poems, but the one that meant the most to the children was a poem that some of you probably know, the poem that asks that question, what happens to a dream deferred? How many know that poem? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? And there was one child in that class who really disliked me. She sat in the back row, and she was a little taller than the other kids. She had a kind of beautiful, proud look in her eyes, but she glared at me. It was that look that you'll see in those old posters of Malcolm X, as though I were like the white devil, and I could never get her to smile all year long. I read that poem, And suddenly she got up from her chair in the back row. She came around to the front of the class, very gently touched me on my shoulder like that. And she just whispered, "Thank you." And then she said, "Could I bring that poem home to show it to my mother?" I was so happy, wouldn't you be? I would have given her my car if she'd asked me. The next day she came in and she had memorized the poem and she asked if she could recite it to the class. And she had those kids in tears. And the next day I was fired from the Boston schools for reading that poem. We had standards in those days, just as we do now. And according to the standards, Langston Hughes was inappropriate for fourth grade children. It turned out he would have been appropriate for eighth grade children. It said Langston Hughes, they said when they fired me, Langston Hughes is an eighth grade poet. He didn't know that when he wrote that. So I was out, and the charge against me was, it was on the front page of the newspaper the next day. It said, Rhodes Scholar fired from fourth grade. The charge was curriculum deviation. Strange way the United States works, at least in those days when we had a pretty liberal administration in Washington. I was fired for curriculum deviation. The next week, I was hired by the federal government for curriculum development. And I had the opportunity to help create the first English curriculum for a program that began that year called Upward Bound. Well, I taught for several years after that in low-income schools. Most of the past 2 decades, I've been working, I wasn't teaching, but I was working with children in schools in the South Bronx in New York. And in these most recent 2 or 3 years, in about 24 other cities, large and small, all over the country. I've written several books about these children that I'm meeting. I mean, when I visit schools, I go to the classrooms, you know, I don't let them corner me in the principal's office. I want to go and sit and see the kids. And I've written a number of books about these children. One of them is titled The Shame of the Nation. Another one, Savage Inequalities. Now, I wish I could stand here tonight and tell you that there's been dramatic progress since I wrote those books. But it simply wouldn't be the truth. The savage inequalities in funding between wealthy and poor districts has not diminished, have not diminished with these years, and in many states have deepened quite significantly. Illinois, as I'm sure many of you already know, stands nearly at the rock bottom among the 50 states in terms of equal funding. How many of you know that? And 47th in state support to local schools, with the lowest allocations typically going to the schools with the highest rates of poverty. So that here in Illinois, as almost everywhere else in the country, the kids who need our help the most repeatedly and shamefully receive the least in terms of public decency. Depending on the will and whim of local legislators and state governors, counting on them to fiddle with the formulas for funding public schools has always been a losing game. I mean, we try everywhere. Even in states where we brought legal actions, like Pennsylvania and Ohio and New York, in places where we've sued the states and won in court, even in those states, the legislators find 1,000 ways to drag their heels and openly defy the orders of the courts. And they do so with impunity. In Ohio, 3 times the Supreme Court of the state found the system unconstitutional and ordered the governing legislature to transform the system of school finance. And they just thumbed their nose at the court. The governor, whose name was Taft, he just said, we don't have the money. I mean, you know, if a black kid in Cincinnati defied the order of the court, we'd send him to jail. They don't do that with governors of states. Sometimes they should. Then, too, on top of that, even within an underfunded district like New York or Los Angeles, I won't pick on Chicago because I like it here. I want to be polite. I want to be invited back. But even within urban districts that are wildly underfunded, a lot of the parents in wealthy neighborhoods within the city will sort of target certain public schools for their children. And then they'll add extra money, they'll raise extra money privately by holding a fundraiser, for example. In New York, they'll do this in certain white neighborhoods, affluent neighborhoods, and they'll pull in $500,000 in one night. You know, and they'll add that to the public funds, but for their children only. And they're not obliged to share a penny with any other school. So, you know, it's almost as if this social order in America, or at least those within it with the greatest wealth and power, it's almost as if they're enamored of inequity, as if they're addicted to inequity, as if they couldn't cope without it. You know, now I had a very privileged education, and it always occurs to me, it always occurs to me that all my victories in life have been contaminated to some degree by the knowledge that I was the winner in a race that had been rigged to my advantage from the start. If we didn't have a bitterly unjust education system in this country, how likely is it that I could have just walked into the college of my choice? Been a lot more competition from poor children. Even more disheartening to anybody who came of age when I did in the civil rights era. Racial isolation is soaring and resurgent in the nation once again. Not only in major cities like Chicago, where it's never really changed, but even in small cities that I visit, like Erie, Pennsylvania, Petersburg, Virginia, and that's an all-black city that I visited a couple months ago, where the surrounding white communities are just a 5-minute drive away. You know, maybe 10 minutes at most, but the district lines are cleverly designed to lock black children out of those much wealthier white schools. Black and Hispanic children at this moment in our history are more isolated intellectually and segregated physically than at any time since 1968, which just happens to be the year when Dr. King was taken from us by assassination. Now, I'm not going to harp on this, but I have to tell you simply, I'm old enough, so I remember Dr. King, not from TV. In 1965, when he came to Boston for the first time to speak at one of those huge outdoor rallies, it was in a place called Boston Common, which was the scene of the Revolutionary War battles. It was one of those huge rallies. Black leaders were very loyal to me. They felt I'd been penalized by the school system for sticking with their kids. So they asked me if I'd like to walk with him and be one of his bodyguards. Look at me. I was a skinny little dweeb. And they didn't need me, and I didn't really stand right next to him anyway. But, I remember his voice. I remember his eyes. And I remember the perspiration pouring down his brow. So he always had a clean white handkerchief in his breast pocket so he could mop his brow. And, I remember his words, and I remember his dream. Now, why do I say that? I'm not going to be maudlin about this, but the reason I say I remember his dream is because every year on Martin Luther King Day, in states where they celebrate it, some white politician never lifted his finger or her finger. Well, it's usually a guy, so I won't try to be gender equal on this. Some guy who's a mayor or somebody who never lifted his finger to address racial segregation or inequity. I don't know why he gets invited to an all-black high school to give a speech on Martin Luther King Day. I don't know why they invite him. And typically he gets up and he says, I too have a dream. And I always wonder what the hell it is. What's his dream? Dr. King did not say, I have a dream that someday in the cities of the East and West and North and South, we will have anxiety-ridden, test-driven, rigidly disciplined, slightly higher-scoring, separate money to schools, with self-help slogans on the wall. And bombastic rhyming rhetoric he chanted all day long. That was not his dream. Dr. King's dream was clean and pure. I have a dream, he said, that someday little white children and little black children, I'm sure today he would also say little brown children, will sit together at the table of brotherhood. At the table of brotherhood. It almost never happens anymore. Well, I'm an old-fashioned guy. I know this seems strange, but I still believe that Dr. King was right. I still believe that Brown versus Board of Education was correct, that separate schools are inherently unequal, and that no matter how we try, and many of us try valiantly to resist this, that no matter what we try, they do tremendous damage to the young mentalities of children by giving them the message that they have been set apart, like an infectious subspecies of the population, so that they cannot contaminate the education of the mainstream of society. And kids I know who grew up, I was speaking not long ago, a lot of young black students who had grown up in Ferguson, Missouri, and nearby in St. Louis, and in inner city Baltimore. Kids I knew who grew up in those settings often tell me of the quiet rage they feel at one young woman who grew up in Ferguson called this colonized existence. But nobody in public life in Washington ever talks about this anymore. They tell us that our teachers need to be accountable for, delivering higher performance. Those children must perform. I hate that verb. Stocks perform. So too apparently must children. I don't like the economic metaphors they use, but they say we're going to hold those teachers accountable for their performance or the kids' performance, but none of them ever say we're going to hold America accountable for reverting to the tainted promises of Plessy versus Ferguson. Well, I want to, I have a lot of friends who just say to me, Jonathan, give it up. Don't talk about this issue anymore. Segregation, I'll say, is an irreversible reality in major cities like Chicago, where only 9% of the children in the public schools are white. Where about 45% are Latino, about nearly 40% African American. They say this is the reality. This is the end result of decades of white flight and the adamant refusal of our states to enforce their housing laws in the surrounding white communities. And they just say this is never going to change, so we have to take this as a permanent reality. I deeply disagree. But if this is the reality for now, then I don't think it's good enough for us to sue the states as Emmanuel is trying to do for equal funding for the children whom we've cheated all these years. We ought to be suing for more than equal funding, for double equal funding, triple equal funding, and call it reparations, and reparations, not the ancient sin of slavery, but the ongoing crime that we're committing to the present day. That's one thing. Now I need to speak about the single most alarming and pernicious danger facing public education in America today. I'm speaking, of course, of the seemingly relentless and high-powered drive for charter schools and vouchers. And I know there are going to be people here who, will feel uncomfortable when I say this. And, if you subscribe to, if you send your kids to charter schools, and I don't condemn you. I don't want to be condescending and arrogant. And there are actually, there are a certain number, a small number of progressive charter schools, some of which were begun by idealistic people. Some of them were friends of mine, as long as 20, 25, 30 years ago, who had no idea that they were planting poison seeds that by setting up a prototype that would be seized upon ultimately by predatory right-wing groups whose motives were entirely different from their own. And I used to warn them. I warned them that, some of these, I'll tell you who some of these people were. Some of them were, you students are so young. Have you ever heard of something called the counterculture of the 1970s? Do you know what that refers to? Like the Beatles, and have you ever heard of them? Love beads and strange food, the healthy food that didn't look like anything your mom and dad ever gave you for dinner. I call them the wheat germ people. Well, some of them started schools like these. And I warned them at the time, and they were called charter schools. And I warned them at the time that they were setting up a stalking horse for privatizing groups that would seize upon this model as a strategy for breaking up the public system altogether. Today we see the consequence in a juggernaut of corporate-funded groups who see this as an opportunity to get their hands on public funds and replace the public system by private market competition, exactly as it was envisioned by advocates for vouchers, like Chicago's Milton Friedman, more than 50 years ago. Do you know who I'm referring to? Conservative economist who, after planting the idea of vouchers in America, went on in his nobility of character to serve as advisor to the dictator Chile, Augusto Pinochet, who was murdering thousands of people, including a lot of devoted Catholics who were devoted to the idea of equality for the poor. Have any of you heard of him? Oh, good. You must have good teachers here. But that's the roots of those are the seeds of the charter school movement. You know, so an individual school might be perfectly fine, and I'd never say to somebody, "Oh, you shouldn't have sent your child there." It's not the individual school. It's the idea. It's the implantation of this concept as public policy. That's what's dangerous. And you know, as countless studies show, there's absolutely no evidence that charter schools or voucher schools, on average, are any more successful than the public schools they're trying to replace. I'm telling you that. But and hundreds of them. You know, I learned this long ago in Milwaukee, which is one of the places where vouchers started first a couple of decades ago. 100 of these schools turned out to be abysmal failures. Some of them would disappear in mid-year, and after they wrecked the kids' education, where the kids go? Back to the public system. You know, where's our responsibility to compensate for the damage they've done? But let me be honest, even in the cases of certain charter schools that claim to post impressive test scores, and there's some that do, it's typically because of a dirty little secret that the public never knows, which is an ingenious selectivity among the students they enroll. Now I say ingenious because they don't like to admit it. They say, "Oh, well, we have a lottery and anybody can come." But it doesn't work that way. The skill of navigating the application process typically screens out the poorest of the poor. Those who are homeless, for example, those who are on the verge of eviction, those who are just scrambling to feed their kids. So even in very poor neighborhoods, it's typically the least poor of the poor and the children of the parents with the greatest social capital whom these schools try to attract. And they're also really good at getting rid of kids who pose unexpected problems. And they don't kick them out. That'd be too coarse and vulgar and obvious. They counsel them out. You know what I mean? "Mrs. Jones, we think your daughter Shaniqua is a really interesting little girl, but we don't think that we can meet her needs. She'd do better back in public school." That's happening everywhere. Well, I'll just add one more thing. Even in deeply segregated cities, charter schools are almost always the most segregated. Did you know that? And this is partly because, at least in most parts of the country, they target their promotion at specific ethnic slices of the population. You know, like Black Leadership Academy of Enterprise and Excellence. That's a typical name. And they're not too original. Who could be against excellence? Who's going to start a school called, Academy of Mediocrity? But how many white people are going to apply to the African American Academy of Enterprise? So, in this sense, these are intentional apartheid institutions. Now, not surprising, I've just been in the South, not surprisingly, we're seeing the parallel phenomenon, and you could have expected this. You know, if it's good for, if it's okay to have a Black Leadership Academy, then why not have an Irish Leadership Academy, right? Who's going to prevent this? And now down south, I didn't mean to pick on Irish people, because they're Jewish, you know, any white ethnic group. And now what we're seeing, at least in the South, I don't know if you've seen this here yet, we're seeing virtually all white charter schools popping up. In North Carolina, a couple of weeks ago, I found that increasing numbers of white families are flocking, who had for several decades kept their kids in the public system. Now they're flocking into charter schools that represent postmodern versions of those invidious white academies. They used to call them white Christian academies that popped up in Virginia after the Brown decision and were shut down by the courts. And now they're coming back. And when they call themselves white Christian academies, it's an insult to Christianity. You know, they degrade, they insult Christianity when they do that. I happen to be Jewish, but I like to be nice to Christians. And, you know, I spend a lot of time in Christian churches. I don't know why. I never get invited to speak in synagogues, except once last year in Cincinnati. I almost always get invited to Catholic universities, and I preach a lot in Catholic churches. And do you know what AME churches are? African Methodist, well, they're classic, you know, historic Black churches. And I don't know why, I preach in a lot of Episcopal cathedrals. Either the Episcopalians are after me and trying to convert me. I've even preached in the ultimate Episcopal, it's a big word, the ultimate Episcopal cathedral, the one in Washington. Have you ever been there, the National Cathedral? And I can't tell you, I mean, that's where presidents go, you know, and House majority leaders, people like that. I can't tell you how much joy it gives me as a Jew to preach the words of Jesus to delinquent Christians. But all I want to say about the charter school thing is that privatizing forces are geniuses at marketing this movement. They're really good at it. They're pouring money into slick advertisements to seduce, especially to seduce the poorest parents of minorities to opt out of the public system and to buy the win over voters in states that are having. In Massachusetts, for example, last year we had a referendum where the privatizing groups wanted to raise the cap on charter schools. Do all of you know what that means? There had been a limit on how many there could be, and they wanted to remove the cap to open the floodgates to charter schools. And boy, they did some slick advertising. And you know where the money came from? It came from right-wing billionaires from out of state. A lot of the money came from the notoriously right-wing Walmart heirs, the Walton family, and other groups like that. I'm going to tell you something. I don't think that we can stop this juggernaut unless an awful lot of really profoundly courageous people in the academic world are willing to come into the political arena and speak with unaccustomed boldness and without ambiguity on this issue. That's my own belief. And I don't mean to pick on DePaul, because I know I have a lot of people here who share my beliefs. Back east, at least, in Boston, people at Harvard are don't know, some of them think they're liberals, but they must be really weary liberals. Low voltage liberals. Okay. Finally, I need to speak about this mania of testing that's swept across the nation over the past 15 years. Since No Child Left Behind was enacted into law under George W. Bush, and which became even more severe and more punitive. I'm so sorry I have to say this, under Arnie Duncan and Barack Obama. And you know, like many of you, I'm sure, I did celebrated President Obama's election. And I still respect him, but not on this issue. It was a great disappointment, because they didn't really continue the privatization drive and the testing drive encouraged under Republicans, but they intensified it by establishing cash inducements to the states to measure the performance of their teachers on the basis of their students' test scores, which in turn has, at least in an awful lot of inner city schools, has introduced an atmosphere that teachers liken to a state of pedagogic siege. Siege. I always forget how to spell that word. I before E, except after something. But anyway, you know what I mean. And I mean, a state of siege in which the only thing that seems to matter is the number you can plaster on the forehead of this little girl or boy by constant drilling for exams. Now, this happens everywhere in America, but the toll it's taking has been not quite so bad in the schools that serve the wealthiest communities. And here's why. Because the parents there are more empowered. They're more influential politically, and many of those parents, they're well educated, have benefited when they were young from a course of study that was child-centered and was progressive in its nature. So, you know, in some of the wealthy suburbs that I visit, and I've been doing this recently in order to compare, and the teachers have, with the support of the parents, have been able to resist the harshest edge of the test agenda. They give the test because they have to, they have no choice, but they don't allow it to distort curriculum entirely. And if they did, the parents would be up in arms, they'd storm the schools, and they have the clout to make their voices heard. Even within the borders of urban districts where the testing regimen is rigorously enforced in general, there are certain schools I find where affluent and influential parents, I see this in New York, on the west side of New York, and in a part of Brooklyn called Park Slope. I'm sure there are sections like this in Chicago, maybe in this neighborhood right here. You know, there's certain areas where influential parents are sort of carving out little pockets of progressive education, relatively progressive, in sort of upscale white communities. And the cities cater to these parents. I saw this, for example, last week in Durham. That's in North Carolina, Durham, so right next to Raleigh. Durham's a nearly all-black and Hispanic school district where the school board has created a lovely little Montessori elementary school, public elementary school. Do you know what Montessori is? You know, it's a joyful, idyllic little enclave of very lucky children whose parents tend to be professors at Duke University. I don't want to be nasty because Duke invited me there. But that's, you know, I'm too old to bite my tongue. And I was in this Montessori school, and kids were smiling. They were happy. They were actually enjoying their childhood. They didn't have this sword above their heads. And it was by far the whitest school in the entire district. In poorest neighborhoods, I don't see so many children smiling. I don't see them lying on the reading rug, just looking at wonderful, enticing books like The Very Hungry Caterpillar. How many have ever read that book? I left out an adverb there, I think. The Very, Very Hungry Caterpillar. I talk about that book so much that a couple of years ago, I got a phone call from the author, and I usually don't answer my phone because I get a lot of strange calls. A little voice said, "Answer the phone," and it was Eric Carr. I was so happy. He wrote that book, of course. I said, "You don't sound like a caterpillar." But you don't see little kids enjoying those books. They're in the cupboard somewhere, for independent reading if they ever get to that after lunch for 20 minutes. But mostly they're just sitting at their desk reading these little scripted texts, mini chunks of test-aligned materials. And because of the Common Core, most of these kids don't even get to read entire books anymore. How many knew that? No, instead they're reading what one teacher in Virginia calls pieces of books, little mini text where it gets interrupted every few paragraphs by sample questions from the PARC exam. That's the exam produced by Pearson. Now look, I'm not hopelessly romantic. I'm not opposed to testing, if it's useful testing, by which I mean diagnostic testing. The kind of testing which teachers in many schools, at least in the progressive suburban schools, teachers write the test themselves and they give it one-on-one to the child. They don't have to wait 6 months to have some testing factory in Singapore send back the results. They know that right then. And it helps the teachers. It tells you right away where little Hillary, let's say, may need more help with passive verbs, or where little Donald needs more help with long division, or maybe needs a therapeutic intervention. But standardized exams don't give teachers that kind of help. And in fact, this was never the intention. The main effect of standardized exams is not to help the teacher, but to terrorize the principals by telling them essentially that if they cannot pump those scores, we may simply fire them or fire all the teachers, or maybe just close the school as they're doing in Chicago, just shut it down, and maybe then hand it over to one of those charter schools that claim to have a magic, research-proven way to turn it all around. Have you ever heard that phrase, turn it all around? And why do they always have 7 ways, They never do, but I'm just pointing out that they're terribly unoriginal in the language that they use. Every time I hear turn around, I wonder, boy, they've been saying that for 22 years. Can't they think of something new? But there's no originality in these school reformers have this sort of frozen lexicon. Anyway, that's the sword that hangs above the heads of a lot of principals in the public schools. And in some of these schools, it gets even worse. I'm not saying that any schools like this in Chicago, but everywhere else I see this, in every major city. Under these so-called, have you ever heard of school improvement plans? things like that the state ordains when a school isn't doing what it's supposed to. What happens is a new regime, I see this in a lot of schools now, a new regime of behavior modification, very reminiscent of B.F. Skinner's rat control psychology, has been introduced to essentially train Black and Latino children in a state of mind that I call conditioned acquiescence. Children sit with folded hands, stare straight at the teacher. I heard this just 3 weeks ago at one of these schools. 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. Ever heard that one? And then 3, 2, 1, I don't know. And then the children were sitting with their partners. It's 1, 2, 3, turn. 1, 2, 3, speak to your partner. It's like numerical madness. It's like the thing neurotics do, or psychotics in mental hospitals who are terrified at the chaos of the universe and feel they can't control it unless they can number everything. They make these endless lists. In one of these schools, there's a whole chain of these schools. These are public schools, by the way, not just charter schools, but they're places where the rote and drill techniques are foisted on the school under state demand. If a child gets distracted and looks out the window, it's known as an infraction. That's the word, an infraction, or an unacceptable behavior. In one school, I saw a list of 12 unacceptable behaviors, but there were 12 punishments, one for each. One unacceptable behavior was wiggling. Wiggling, for 6-year-olds. Another one was rolling your eyes. Another one was sighing. And there was a lot to sigh about in that school. And the consequences were severe. One of the consequences was something known as, quote, the calm down chair. You ever heard of that? It was a shaming ritual. In more serious infractions, a child was sent to a storage closet that was called the calm down room. You've never heard of this? Oh, this is happening in dozens of schools, including New York and Boston. I mean, I saw one with my own eyes in Boston. The ethos behind this is something called the broken window theory of policing. How many have heard that term? Which is modeled on the idea that if you let criminals commit small offenses, then they'll create big ones. But it's now applied to classroom management in schools that serve minorities. Well, I won't go on with this. There's another horrible term I hear now, which is the value-added child. How many have heard that one? How much value did you add to the child this year? It's an economic concept. The child isn't perceived as a child, but as a piece of raw material with no inherent value. We're supposed to turn it into a marketable product. And product, that's another term I hear. Of course, if children are perceived as products, then product testing makes perfect sense. So why not test them all year long? All right. Let me make just 2 last points. Even in schools that have tried to resist this severity, a lot of the principals are still running scared. And so the teachers are being told, don't let those children wander from the standards of the state. There's no time to let them ask too many questions or indulge in curiosity. Curiosity won't be tested. Spontaneity, originality aren't going to be tested. Delight in learning will not be rewarded on the state exam. Delight, in fact, can get you way off track. Leave delight and spontaneity to, to children in the suburbs. These kids can't afford it. The trouble is, how many of you have taught young children in elementary school? Oh, good. Well, as you know, young children especially, they want to ask their questions. They want to tell their stories, and the really little ones, especially in first or second grade, are gifted artists at subverting lesson plans. They're really good at that. They'll wave their fingers in your face, and even when they're right in front of you, and they're squirmy little people. They defy the laws of gravity. They stretch out from their chairs. They're nearly falling out of their chairs as they're so eager to get your attention. And I go into classrooms, and teachers sometimes lets me take the class, and there's, someone in the front row, a little girl I'm thinking of, sort of poking her fingers right in my face, and I poke my eyes out, and she's making these horrible sounds, ooh, 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 like that. She's gonna die if I won't call on her. And so, so there's the teacher with the standard, written on the board. Do you have to do that here? The outcome that's aligned with the state standard, written on the board, or the new electronic board, whatever it is. And she's doing her best to achieve the outcome mandated for that moment in the morning. And a little kid, I'm thinking of a real little boy I remember named Reginald. Well, he's still named Reginald. He's still alive, but this was a couple of years ago. And he raises his hand, and she's just introducing her lesson. And he raises his hand and he says, "Teacher." And she thinks, Reginald is a good little boy and he likes me. So I'm going to take a chance and answer him. Maybe he's going to help me reach my outcome. Foolish hope. So she says, "Yes, sweetie." This was first grade. She said, "Yes, sweetie." And he says, "Guess what?" See, they always do that. They never tell you anything. You have to guess. So she says, "What?" And he says, "Yesterday, my auntie and uncle took me to the zoo, and guess what?" Now she knows she's losing it. It's too late. So she says, "What?" And he says, "And I saw a baby bear that had just been born, and they let me touch his nose, and it was wet and warm, and off he goes for one of those endless, eternal run-on sentences, piling on the ands and buts. I mean, 6-year-olds are almost as good at that as William Faulkner. Endless sentences. And sometimes at the end of all those ands and buts, there's a piece of hidden treasure where that little child unveils something deep and secret in her soul, in his soul. And teachers use that piece of hidden treasure to unlock motivation. Research, and I always say, don't cut them off. Don't silence their voices. Make sure, do everything you can to make sure those little voices will be heard. And never let those children think their value can be measured by their scores on an exam. Tell them that you value them and love them for who they really are. Tell them that you love them when they're smiling, you love them when they're squirming, and you love them when they're so excited that they can't stay in their chairs. I say that all the time. School superintendents hate it when I say that. But and I often say there's absolutely no reason why any school should ever have to choose between providing children with all the skills they're ever going to need to lead full and rewarding lives in this competitive society, and also giving them a taste of joy and sweetness and thousands of moments of delight and whim and wonderment and laughter and a constant affirmation of the goodness of existence in the only years of innocence those kids will ever have. You know, because once those years are gone, nobody can give them back to them again. So I'm going to end this on a personal note. I have to tell, I'm going to take an extra 5 minutes because I have to tell you something something that just happened to me. I got a call a couple of weeks ago from the New York Times, you know, and nobody ignores a call from the New York Times, except Donald Trump, I suppose. Even he talks to them. And they said they wanted to interview me. So I said, great. They haven't called me for a couple of years. Good. I hope it's about charter schools, you know. Guess what it was about? They said that they were writing my obituary and wanted to check out a couple of facts. So, you know, I sat down and I wrote a reply, and I said, what do you want to know? Like, cause of death? But I'm not dead, you know? And you know, I have 3 more books I want to write. Call me back 10 years from now, you know? But you know how we write these things and then we never dare to send them. So I sent them a polite reply, but it did serve as a kind of wake-up call. I was 81 years old this fall, and you know, a lot of people of my age are a little older whom I've relied upon for guidance in my work all my life have been taken from this world in these recent years. Over the last decade, 10, 15 years, a lot of people I sort of counted on to give me strength, because no matter how old you are, you know, it always helps when there's somebody a little older who seems wiser to, I don't know, to help you to feel brave. You know? I'm thinking in particular of my best and oldest friend in education. Now, some of you are very political, probably think I'm going to name some dangerous radical, like Paulo Freire. How many have heard of him? Oh, I love Paulo, you know. But that's not who I have in mind. I'm thinking of a very sweet and gentle soul. Maybe the best friend little children in this nation had for almost 50 years. A man I think some of you will probably remember by the name of Mr. Rogers. Fred Rogers. Once when Fred and I were in New York together, I forget why, we spoke at some event. We were the speakers. It was the 100th anniversary of the American Montessori Society, ironically. He was too shy to speak, so I spoke and he played the piano. It was over early, it was over before noon, and he asked, is there still time to visit public schools? And I said, yes. And he said, would you like to take me up to the South Bronx to meet the kids you've been writing about? And I said, I would love to do that. He said, how do you get there? We had no trolley in New York. So I said, well, to be honest, the subway, the train is the quickest way. If you know New York, it's like from Midtown Manhattan, from the richest neighborhood in the Western world, probably, to the poorest section of the Bronx is just a straight ride on the number 6 line. It's about maybe 12 minutes. He said, good, let's go on the subway. He liked that idea. So we go down the smelly subway in New York, and we get on the train and come out at Brook Avenue, which was the station, the stop, right near the schools I'd been visiting. And at that time, Brook Avenue was a really rough street. It's better now, but at that time it was the heart of the heroin trade. And I knew that because late at night in the neighborhood, when I would visit schools, and then kids would bring me home, and their grandparents, grandparents would keep me for dinner, and we'd talk late, and then they wouldn't let me walk back to the subway on my own. Grandmothers would insist on walking me, so I'd be safe. And there's Mr. Rogers and I walking on Brook Avenue together. And nobody bothered him, but I kept thinking maybe nobody will remember who he is, because we're so divided in this country. Maybe nobody here knows who he is. I didn't have to fear that. Suddenly a sanitation truck came screeching to a halt, and a middle-aged African-American man jumped out of the cab and lifted Mr. Rogers off the ground. Then we went to the local public school, one that I loved, with the principal, marvelous woman, Aida Rosa, who was Puerto Rican, had developed, it was one of those wonderful exceptions that I look for everywhere. She developed a warm, child-centered atmosphere within that school. I don't know how she did it. I never would take someone like Mr. Rogers to a charter school, went a regular public school, and not one that had extra money, not one of those showpiece schools that school districts love to show off to visitors, TV cameras. A regular school, badly funded, but where the principal had made something beautiful. The teachers were almost more moved than the kids were when Mr. Rogers walked in. And he sat with the little ones, he squeezed his bottom in those little chairs, and asked them good questions, not about tests or anything, but belly buttons, itchy elbows, things that matter in this world. And then at the end of school, we went to an after school around the corner in an Episcopal church, which was not competing with the public schools, but was supporting the public schools with after-school arts and beautiful creative stuff. And we go in the place, it's packed. There are 90 kids there just arriving from their schools and getting their snack. And that's the first thing, they have a snack. And at the far end of the room, there was this little boy that I knew really well named Mario. And I'd written about him, and that's his real name, at least it was. Well, it still is. Like, I don't know why I do that. So their names change when they become 20 years old. Mario, I don't want to say he was fat, because I don't want to sound like, I'm criticizing people who are overweight, but he was round. He was a little round. His face looked like an olive with a smile painted on it. He was a sweet little boy, 6 years old. And, kids like that age don't like you. They can make it very obvious. But if they like you, you're in for it. And he spots Mr. Rogers right away. And he goes straight across the room. And with his arms out kind of, he looked like a little jet-powered bumblebee, like a World War II attack plane. And the moment of collision, Mr. Rogers sitting down. At the moment of collision, he wrapped his arms around Mr. Rogers' head, gave him a big kiss on the forehead, looked him right in the eyes, and said, "Welcome to my neighborhood, Mr. Rogers." And Fred later said, I'll never forget the little boy. He said, "The sorrow is that we don't say the same to Maria." And now he's gone. When I knew Fred was dying, I used to pray just like a child. honest to God. I used to say, God, let them live one more year. Have you ever done that with someone you love? It seems irrational, you know. Why should God obey you? But I'd do that, I'd say maybe 2 years. I'd sort of bargain with God, you know. I'm Jewish, so maybe I thought it was okay because we knew him a little longer than you did. And I say, you know, he's such a good man. I used to say this at night, he's such a good man. Let him live forever. But of course I knew deep down, he can't, none of us can. We all know we're gonna die someday and lose the ones we love the most to death. The old trees and the foolishness of children will outlive us all. My friends, life goes so fast. Use it well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. So for those of you who have to exit, we'll give you a couple minutes, and Jonathan Kozol is going to ask. Do take some questions. We have some cards already that we've sort of put together. So about 2 minutes.
Minutes of questions, and that's because I know a lot of teachers, especially, and student teachers, like to ask me individual questions, and I'll be glad to hang out as long as you like later. Don't have to buy a book to get in line.
Okay, the first question. When did you know that champion the cause for disenfranchised students and educational inequity was your mission?
Well, I never really thought of it that way. That makes me sound too heroic, actually. And besides, you know, I was just one of zillions of relatively young people who felt drawn into the struggle. Mike Klonsky is here, Bill Ayers, are a little younger than I, but roughly of my generation. You know, they were among thousands of young people, not only white, but also, you know, mixtures of white, black, rich, and poor, who felt that education was one of the few areas where it seemed possible to make social change. Not ignoring the other injustices, but it seemed like a possible lever of change. And you know, people used to say to me, well, what about poor health care, and what about food insufficiency, which has come back raging in America now as the Trump administration is trying to cut food stamps. But you know, I'd say, well, if I were a pediatrician or nutritional expert, that's where I'd take my stand. You know, if I were a legal advocate, I'd try to criminalize landlords and major banks that still engage, as they do blatantly, in racial steering and creating residential segregation, but I'm not. I mean, I can teach maybe, so that's where I'm going to take my stand.
This question is about your writing. In terms of Savage Inequalities, it's 3 parts. What motivated you to write the book? And why did you include that school? And how did you come up with Savage? Would you consider your work an ethnographic?
What was the second part of the question?
Why did you include the school that you chose in Savage Inequalities?
Oh, I see, okay.
And the word savage.
Right, well, I won't answer the first question because I kind of answered that one already, the first part. Why did I do this? But the schools I chose, it was really kind of accidental, and that's important because I didn't just hunt around for wildly unequal schools. I tended to rely on teachers in different parts of the country. You know, I visited a university, and then at the end of a lecture, this will probably happen tonight, some teacher, a student teacher would say, you ought to visit this particular school. You'll see, we have 34 kids in a class, believe it or not, things like that. And where, I'm used to seeing in the suburbs, parents freak out when it gets more than 20. And there's something like that. So they'll say, get up early tomorrow morning, I'll drag you to my school. So that's kind of how it happened. I chose the word savage because the language of some of the sociologists of that period, they were always sort of assuming that the poor kids, poor black kids, even poor white kids, poor white rural kids, and poor Latinos, that they had something savage about them. It was a racist assumption. It's the same thing we see today in this broken window theory of policing. Troubled streets and troubled souls. You gotta get tough with them. That's how they justified whipping in Boston those days. And my point was that the ultimate, the only real savagery that I could see in America was the savagery of our society in cheating these children from the hour of their birth. See, that's why I tried to turn it around. The savage inequalities were of our making, not the children. It wasn't the children's fault. They'd done nothing wrong. Their only sin was to have been born in the wrong neighborhood, of a skin color that was not valued in America. Some people got mad at me for using that title, but I don't care.
Today, fourth grade boys have the lowest scoring reading scores. They are also routed to special ed, expelled more than any other group. For teachers in a flawed public school system nationally and in CPS, how can they make systemic changes from their classrooms?
Did you say fourth grade boys, or did they say fourth grade African American boys? Because that would make.
I think it's fourth grade African American boys.
I think that's a common statistic. I mean, it's not just fourth graders. There's one at charter school in Boston, which started by a man named King. He later became education secretary briefly. Am I correct? After Ronnie Duncan? Am I right? John King? Yeah, he had briefly been, I think, had founded this school. They suspended or expelled like half their kindergarten students. I couldn't believe it. I mean, what could kindergarten children have done to warrant this? Did they threaten to assassinate him or something? He could defend himself, I should think. Yes, these are, I don't know the exact statistic that this person quoted, but this is a common statistic, of course. Suspensions and expulsions have been infinitely higher, well, many times higher for Black and Latino children and for poor children. But there's always been a racial edge to this, and it's increased. And then, I guess the question was also the test scores being the lowest. That's probably been true also, but there are obvious reasons for it. Number one is the old issue, which I started raising probably when I brought Langston Hughes into the classroom, that the materials are culturally loaded against those kids. That there's been very little effort to build upon the motivations that come out of their own rich heritage. Not just in African American communities, but I sensed this recently when I spent several weeks. I've been back a few times to one of the poorest rural areas in the country, which is the San Joaquin Valley in California, not far from Los Angeles, where very low-income Latino children live, children of farm workers who still bend over every day to pick the groceries that we buy in our supermarkets. I happen to be in a town where they they pick those. Have you ever been to the grocery store and seen these carrots that are very little, like baby carrots? How many have seen them? I used to think this was some kind of a trick, you know, but they really grow them that way. I was in a town where all those baby carrots come from, and the parents bend over in the fields, and they've used pesticides so long the kids can't even drink the water in school. A friend of mine named Dolores Huerta had to organize private money to put filters into public schools so the kids could drink the water because they were getting poisoned with arsenic. You know, does it surprise you that their test scores might have been a little low? Toxins, neurological poisoning, even in states like Illinois that pretends to have some kind of universal preschool, they never really deliver. This is a myth that every state perpetuates. They always say, we're going to do it next year or something. But how many of the poorest Latino and Black kids that we meet in these schools ever got what all my affluent white friends get by for their children on the private market? In New York City, my wealthy friends, Harvard classmates, or their children, typically give their children 3 or 3.5 years of beautiful, full-day, happy, developmental preschool education that prepares them for the classroom without drilling them to death, and also gives them a neurological stimulation, which we know now is essential for children. And most of the inner city kids, they're lucky if they get 1 year of half-day pre-K. If I'm wrong in Chicago, then this is the one exception in America. And that's the way it is. And you know, and then when they take tests, which kids are likely to score highest? You know, the ones who who've had all that wonderful pre-K and cruise into school, really comfortable. They don't even have to learn the alphabet. They sit on it in preschool. You know, you sit on a long A on the rug. You learn it by osmosis through your bottom. You know, it's happy, and they learn. If we want to change this, I mean, the one thing I do, if we really want to make it down in test scores, if we have to talk about test scores, I'd say take all those multi-billions of dollars that we're wasting now on 2 multi-global corporations, one of which is known as Pearson, that manufactures virtually all the standardized exams. I would take all that money and pour it into 3 full years of the best developmental pre-K money can buy.
Okay. Given the current state of education, would it be better to focus on creating and studying educational alternatives rather than prop up a system so controlled by an accountability regime? And the second part is are there any feasible public school funding formulas in America?
Well, on the first point, no, I don't want to look outside the system, because the trouble with these alternatives is that even when they promote themselves as being like models for change within the public system, which is how they originally promoted charter schools, that never really proves to be the case, because they're creating atypical situations. You know, if you and if 5 of us decided to, you know, start a school in the poorest, lowest scoring neighborhood in America, and we had the, you know, ideal opportunity to select the kids we wanted, or just the parents who enrolled their kids in the school were parents who already knew us, who maybe, you know, done a graduate degree at a university where they met us, something like that. Or at least parents who, been to community college, something like that. We could come up with great scores, but it wouldn't be a model for anything. You know, I think we have to look for those models within the public system. And instead of closing schools, as Rahm Emanuel is doing, we ought to keep those schools open. If they're small, all the better. If there's small enrollment, double the teachers' salaries, put more teachers into those schools, give them the kind of grown-up child ratio that they have at terrific private schools, and let those be the models for the school reform. That's it. By the way, it's sort of axiomatic among the right-wing groups and the think tanks like the Heritage Foundation. That's the place that first coined the term no excuses education, by the way. It's sort of axiomatic among them that class size doesn't matter. Have you ever heard that? And there's some economist, I think his name is Eric Hanushek, who, like, I'm sure Bill will remember him. He's like always been opposed to anything decent in America until the attack. He's at some lovely place like the Hoover Institution in California. You know, I don't know, is he or someone like that? They say, according to our data, class size makes no difference. You know? But those same people, you know, when their kids they're not even happy with the top suburban schools where they live. When their kids are old enough, they send them to New England prep schools. Like Exeter. Have you ever heard of Exeter? Or Andover? I live right near those schools. Do you know what class size is at those schools? The last time I checked, it was capped at 13. I don't know if that's good for, you know, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Bush family and other wealthy families. No, it's good for the poorest child in America. People often tease and joke, say it didn't help George W. with his syntax. But they say the English faculty must have done sabbatical while he was there. But these days he looks kind of good. kind at least.
I think this is your last question.
Sure.
It's two-part. One question is by a young person who is here at age 11. I don't know if they're here
good.
right now. How do you create change in the world of diversity in education when it is already so corrupt with racism? How do you create change in the world of diversity in education when it is already so corrupt with racism? And the second part is, in America today, where do you find hope for the future of public education and American democracy?
Well, good question. Well, the first part of it, I'm so glad an 11-year-old asked that question. I want to try to do, oh, hi. Is that you? Hi. What's your name? Ashton? Hi. Well, I won't deal with the university part of it, but because I know DePaul has done a lot to promote diversity, more than most universities I visit, by the way. But, you know, at the early level, I'm telling you, when kids of different ethnicities go to school together, starting when they're young, the vast majority of these tensions, I mean, when they're really young, you know, don't wait till they're in 8th grade, when they already have sort of, you know, may distrust each other. When they're little, when they're 5, 6 years old, if they start then, I think 90% of it is distrust, just false stereotypes evaporate. There's no time for them to grow. You know, I don't like to resort to old platitudes, but there was a song that was popular when I was a kid, something the lyrics were the effect that you have to learn how to hate. You remember that? What was it from? I see. Well, I think it's almost the reverse. I think once you become strangers to each other, it's a struggle to learn how not to hate or fear. Where have I seen this? You asked for a few examples. Well, I'm going to give you a quick example. In Massachusetts, I spent my whole life condemning that state, Boston especially, because it has this false liberal image around the country. We've done a few good things. We've produced a really good senator who might run for president someday. You know what I mean? Yeah. But there's something that doesn't get any press attention. In the area right around Boston, there are about 34 suburbs where there must be 500,000 kids in the public schools in those suburbs. And the city has only about now 60,000 kids because of white flight. It's overwhelmingly minority. And for 50 years, there has been little notice. There has been an inter-district voluntary integration program. Unfortunately, it's not two-way, and it should be. But even with that liability, there's always been a huge waiting list among inner city Latino and Black families to get into the program. And all the suburban, there are 34 school districts, and there are about 10,000 children in the program at any one time. But the waiting list is always typically it was like 15 or 20,000, which is like a third of all the minority kids in Boston. The parents are on that waiting list. So do poor folks and people of color still believe in integration? If they think it's really possible and that it will be done in a respectful way, it will be done with sensitivity, and the kids will really get into better schools that are better funded because the local residents have the political clout to get the funding, they obviously do. Parents who love their children are not going to say, no, we don't want this. It offends our pride. It might offend their pride, but most parents I know will do anything to get their children into this program. They can go to schools like the district in which I grew up, and where I later taught. I taught in the first year of this program. And talk about test scores, I hate to, but graduation rates. In the city, typically about 60 to 70% of minority kids graduate in 4 years. I think they recently celebrated that it got to 60%. In this program, like 95% of the kids, the minority kids, graduate in 4 years. Almost all of them go on to 4-year colleges and graduate from those colleges. Is there some tension? Yeah, some of those districts are less sensitive than others. But some of them are very sensitive. And I've visited schools where they don't simply bring those kids, but they go out of their way to make sure they have faculty members who are racial role models for those children. They've hired parents from the city to serve as advocates for those children in the schools. And is it all benevolent? No, but by and large, these are communities which the grandparents, the older generation, were the ones who were fighting for racial justice in the South. And there's enough leadership from the churches and the synagogues, from good priests and ministers and rabbis and civic leaders, to practice what they preach at home. Is this an idyllic thing? No. And those who want to discredit it can always interview some, like an African-American student who says, I felt socially isolated at first. I'm sure that happens, but I don't know, when they have their 10-year reunions and their 20-year reunions, and they all go back, and they all remember the same mean phys ed teacher whom they didn't like. And they all remember that the art teacher was wonderful. They all remember that they had big stuffed animals in 3rd grade on their reading rack. They all remember the eccentric teacher who let golden retrievers come to class. I was the one who did that. And you asked for a little sense of hope. Is that going to ever happen on a widespread basis in America? It'd be pretty hard in this, given the logistics of a city like Chicago, but just because of size. But there are a lot of ways to do this. That's all I'm saying. It takes ingenuity, but all I'm saying is that what we have today is not inevitable. This is not an act of God. It was created by human beings, some of them with very bad motives, and some of them just sort of acquiesced in it because that's the system that they found, and it just happened to be convenient for the privileged. But the generation now in college can change it. I probably won't live to see it, but some of you might. So, give it a good try. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Obviously, very incredible.